My name is Emma. I'm 28 years old, and this is the story of how one message brought back someone I thought was gone forever. Have you ever lost someone so important that you felt like a part of your soul was ripped away? I'm talking about that kind of loss that makes you question everything you believed about love, hope, and second chances. It was a Tuesday evening when my phone buzzed with a message that would turn my entire world upside down. If you've ever experienced a loss that felt impossible to recover from, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what I'm about to share might just change how you see hope and healing forever. 3 months earlier, I thought David was dead. The police had told me there was an accident, that his car had gone off the bridge during that terrible storm. They searched for weeks, but his body was never found, and eventually, they declared him legally dead. I held a funeral with an empty casket, surrounded by friends and family who tried to comfort me with words that felt hollow. The investigation was closed, the case was filed away, and I was left with nothing but memories and a wedding ring that would never be used. But that Tuesday evening, as I sat in our old apartment surrounded by boxes I still couldn't bring myself to pack, my phone lit up. The notification showed a message from an unknown number, but when I read the words, my blood turned to ice. Emma, it's me. I'm alive. Don't trust anyone. Meet me at our spot tomorrow at midnight. Come alone. My hand started shaking so violently that I almost dropped the phone, because those words, they were written exactly the way David used to write when he was scared or hiding something important. You might think I was losing my mind, that grief was playing cruel tricks on me. Trust me, that's exactly what I thought too, because how could someone who was declared dead suddenly send me a text message? But there were details in that message that only David would know. The way he always said, "our spot," instead of naming the actual place. The way he used periods instead of exclamation marks when he was serious. My heart was racing between hope and terror, because what if it really was him? But what if it wasn't? That night, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except that message. I must have read it 1,000 times, analyzing every word, every letter, searching for proof that it was really him. Part of me wanted to call the police, but another part of me was terrified they would dismiss it as spam or someone playing a sick joke. The David I knew was careful, methodical, and if he was reaching out to me in secret, there had to be a reason why he couldn't just come home. But that's when things took a turn I never saw coming. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand what David meant to me, because without that context, nothing else will make sense. We had been together for 5 years, and he wasn't just my boyfriend. He was my anchor, my safe place, my home in human form. Have you ever met someone who just gets you on a level that feels almost supernatural? If you have, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video, because you'll understand exactly why what happened next nearly destroyed me, and why that message felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. David was the kind of person who remembered that I liked my coffee with exactly 2 sugars. Not 1, not 3. He would leave little notes in my lunch bag every morning before work. Silly drawings and inside jokes that made me smile even on the worst days. When I had anxiety attacks, he didn't try to fix me or tell me to calm down. He would just sit with me and breathe slowly until my breathing matched his. We had this routine where every Sunday morning, we would go to this little diner outside town and share pancakes while planning our future together, dreaming about the house we would buy and the kids we would have. The proposal happened on a rainy Thursday evening, not in some fancy restaurant or scenic location, but in our kitchen while I was making pasta, and he was supposed to be setting the table. Instead of plates and forks, I turned around to find him on one knee with a ring that took my breath away. Not because it was expensive, but because it was perfect. He said he couldn't wait for the perfect moment, because every moment with me already was perfect, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life making pasta and setting tables together. I said yes before he even finished asking the question, and we spent the rest of the night dancing in our socks to music only we could hear. Our relationship wasn't perfect. We fought about stupid things like who forgot to buy milk or whether to watch action movies or romantic comedies on date night. But even our fights felt safe, because we both knew that no matter what we argued about, we would always choose each other at the end of the day. David had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in his universe, like he would move mountains just to see me smile. When he talked about our future, his eyes would light up with this excitement that made me believe we could conquer anything as long as we were together. That's why losing him felt like losing half of myself, like trying to breathe with only one lung, or trying to walk with only one leg. The world suddenly became this cold, colorless place where nothing made sense anymore, where my coffee tasted wrong, and Sunday mornings felt like punishment. I had never understood what people meant when they said someone died of a broken heart, but after David's accident, I finally got it, because there were days when the pain in my chest was so intense that I wasn't sure my heart would keep beating. But what I didn't know yet was that the real heartbreak was still waiting for me. What made our love story special wasn't the grand gestures or perfect moments you see in movies. It was the small, ordinary things that somehow felt magical when we did them together. David had this habit of singing off-key in the shower every morning, these old rock songs that he absolutely butchered, but it became my favorite sound in the world. I used to tease him about it, telling him he could wake the neighbors 3 blocks away. But secretly, I loved how confident and carefree he sounded when he thought no one was listening. Those morning concerts became the soundtrack of our life together, and I never imagined that one day the silence in our bathroom would feel so deafening. We had our own language of inside jokes and silly traditions that probably made no sense to anyone else, but felt like the most natural thing in the world to us. Every time we passed a yellow car, we would both shout, "Banana Mobile," and the first one to say it got to pick what we had for dinner that night. When we watched movies together, David would always try to guess the ending in the first 10 minutes, and he was almost always completely wrong, which made me laugh until my sides hurt. We had this thing where we would leave each other random love notes in the most unexpected places, tucked inside book pages, taped to the bathroom mirror, hidden in jacket pockets. The day before the accident, we had one of those perfect ordinary days that you don't realize are perfect until they're gone forever. We slept in late, made breakfast together while still in our pajamas, and spent the afternoon at the farmer's market arguing about whether to buy regular tomatoes or the fancy heirloom ones. David insisted on getting both because he said life was too short to compromise on tomatoes, and we ended up making this amazing pasta sauce that we ate while binge-watching some terrible reality TV show. That night, he fell asleep with his head on my shoulder, and I remember thinking that this was what happiness looked like. Not fireworks or celebrations, but quiet contentment with your favorite person. If someone had told me that would be our last normal day together, I would have memorized every second, every laugh, every casual touch. I would have told him I loved him more times, held him tighter, made that moment stretch into eternity somehow. But that's the cruel thing about life. You don't get warning labels on your last moments with someone. You don't get to prepare for the day when everything you thought was permanent suddenly disappears. We went to bed that night, talking about weekend plans and what to plant in our little garden come spring, completely unaware that in less than 24 hours, I would be identifying his belongings at a police station. Looking back now, I realized that those ordinary moments were actually extraordinary because they were ours, because they were built on a foundation of trust and love that I thought was unshakable. David wasn't just my boyfriend or my fiancé. He was my best friend, my partner in all the silly and serious things that make up a life together. But what I didn't know then was that trust, no matter how deep, can be shattered in ways you never see coming, and the person you think you know better than yourself might be hiding secrets that will change everything. The David I mourned was about to become someone I'd never met before. The thing about grief that no one ever tells you is that it's not just sadness. It's like your entire body is rejecting the reality that this person is gone forever. Have you ever felt so empty inside that you wondered if you were disappearing too, piece by piece, day by day? If you've ever experienced that kind of soul-crushing loneliness, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what I'm about to share about the darkest period of my life might help you feel less alone in your own journey through loss and healing. The first week after David's accident was a blur of funeral preparations, condolence calls, and people bringing casseroles I couldn't bring myself to eat. Everyone kept saying I was handling it well, because I wasn't crying hysterically or falling apart in public. But the truth was I felt completely numb, like I was watching someone else's life from the outside. Friends and family surrounded me with their good intentions, but their presence only made me feel more isolated, because none of them could understand the specific shape of my loss. They would share stories about David, trying to comfort me, but their memories felt like they were talking about a stranger, because the David they knew was different from the David who was mine. Once the funeral was over and everyone went back to their normal lives, the real nightmare began. The suffocating silence of our apartment that still smelled like his cologne and coffee. I would wake up every morning forgetting for just a split second that he was gone, reaching across the bed to find empty sheets and a pillow that would never have his scent again. His toothbrush was still in the holder next to mine. His favorite mug was still in the cabinet. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand next to a book he would never finish. Every single object in our home became a tiny knife, cutting me with memories of a future we would never have. The worst part wasn't the big moments like birthdays or holidays that I knew would be hard. It was the small, unexpected triggers that would knock me to my knees without warning. The sound of his favorite song playing in a grocery store, seeing a man in a coffee shop wearing the same jacket David loved, getting a notification from a streaming service asking if I wanted to continue watching a show we'd started together. I stopped going to our favorite places because everything reminded me of him. But then I realized that everywhere reminded me of him, because our 5 years together had touched every corner of my world. Sleep became my enemy because dreams would bring him back to life so vividly that waking up felt like losing him all over again every single morning. I would dream that the accident never happened, that he would walk through our front door with takeout from our favorite restaurant and ask me about my day, like nothing had changed. Then I would wake up to the brutal reality of empty coffee cups and silent Sunday mornings, feeling like my chest was being crushed by the weight of a grief I didn't know how to carry. What I couldn't have imagined was that 3 months later, a single text message would make me question everything I thought I knew about his death, and whether the person I was grieving had ever really existed at all. That Tuesday evening started like every other evening in the past 3 months. Me sitting alone in our apartment, surrounded by boxes I couldn't bring myself to pack, eating takeout straight from the container while mindlessly scrolling through my phone. Have you ever had a moment when your entire world shifted in the span of a few seconds? When everything you thought you knew suddenly became a question mark? I was about to learn that grief can play tricks on your mind, but sometimes the impossible actually happens when you least expect it, and reality becomes stranger than any dream you could imagine. I remember the exact time because I had been staring at the clock, dreading another sleepless night ahead of me. It was 8:47 p.m. when my phone buzzed with a text notification. At first, I almost ignored it because I had been getting a lot of spam messages lately. And honestly, I didn't have the energy to deal with anyone trying to sell me something or asking how I was doing. But something made me look at the screen, maybe just muscle memory or boredom. And that's when I saw the message that would change everything. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, just a string of digits I didn't recognize. But the words that appeared made my blood freeze in my veins. Emma, it's me. I know you think I'm dead, but I'm not. I've been hiding and I need to see you. My hand started shaking so violently that I almost dropped my phone, because those words were impossible. Absolutely impossible according to everything I had been told. David was dead. I had seen the police report. I had attended his funeral. I had cried over his empty coffin for 3 months. But there was something about the way the message was written, something familiar in the tone and choice of words that made my heart start racing with a mixture of hope and terror that felt like it might kill me. I must have read that message 50 times in the first minute, analyzing every word, every punctuation mark, searching for some sign that this was real or proof that someone was playing a cruel joke on me. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that dead people don't send text messages, that I was probably losing my mind from grief and loneliness. But there was another part of me, a desperate part that had been slowly dying for 3 months, that grabbed onto this message like a life preserver in a storm. Could it really be him? Or was I so broken by loss that I was imagining impossible things? The message had been sent from a number I didn't recognize, but as I stared at those words, details started jumping out at me that only David would know. The way he wrote, "It's me," instead of his name. The way he always said he was hiding instead of in trouble when something was wrong. The way he used my full name instead of the pet names everyone else called me. My logical mind was at war with my desperate heart, and I found myself caught between hope and fear, wondering if I was about to discover that miracles really do happen, or if I was about to fall deeper into a grief so intense it would destroy what was left of my sanity. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the impossible is just the beginning of something even more unbelievable. The second message arrived exactly 30 minutes later, and this time there was no doubt in my mind that whoever was writing knew things that only David could possibly know. Have you ever received news so shocking that your brain simply refused to process it, like your mind was protecting you from information too overwhelming to handle? This message contained details about our relationship, our private moments, our inside jokes that we had never shared with another living soul, and reading it felt like being struck by lightning and embraced by a ghost at the same time. Remember our first date when you wore that blue dress with the tiny flowers, and I spilled wine on my shirt because I was so nervous I could barely hold my glass steady? You laughed and said it looked like abstract art, and that's when I knew I was falling in love with you. My legs gave out, and I sank onto our couch, because that memory was ours alone. I had never told that story to anyone, not even my best friend Sarah. The blue dress was hanging in our closet. The wine stain on David's white shirt had become a running joke between us, and the way he had looked at me that night was burned into my memory as the moment everything changed between us. But the message didn't stop there, and with each word, my world was being turned completely upside down in ways I couldn't begin to understand. I can't explain everything in a text, but I need you to know that my death was staged, that I had to disappear to protect you from something bigger and more dangerous than you can imagine. There are people who think I'm dead, and it has to stay that way until I can figure out how to keep you safe. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone, because if this was really David, it meant that everything I had been told about his death was a lie. The final part of the message hit me like a physical blow, because it contained information that proved beyond any doubt that this person knew David's deepest secrets and fears. I know you're probably thinking I've lost my mind, or that someone is playing a sick joke on you, but go to our bedroom closet, behind the shoebox with your winter boots, and you'll find an envelope I hid there before the accident. Inside is a letter I wrote for you, just in case something like this ever happened. The letter will explain everything, and it will prove that this is really me reaching out to you from the shadows. I ran to our bedroom closet so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. Behind the shoebox, exactly where the message said it would be, was a white envelope with my name written in David's unmistakable handwriting, the same handwriting I had seen on 1,000 love notes and grocery lists and birthday cards. Inside was a letter dated just 2 days before his supposed death, explaining things that would shatter every assumption I had made about the man I thought I knew better than myself. But what that letter revealed about David's secret life would make me realize that the person I had been mourning might have been a stranger all along. Opening that letter felt like opening Pandora's box, because once I read David's words, there would be no going back to the simple grief I had been living with for 3 months. Have you ever been faced with information that could either give you everything you've been praying for, or destroy the last pieces of your sanity? If you've ever stood at a crossroads where both paths seemed equally terrifying, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video, because what I discovered in that letter would challenge everything I thought I knew about love, truth, and the person I had planned to marry. The letter was written in David's careful handwriting, the same writing that had filled birthday cards and grocery lists and sweet notes left on my pillow. But the words inside were like nothing he had ever written before. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, it means something has gone wrong, and I've had to disappear to protect you from the mistakes I made before we met. I work for people who don't forgive, who don't forget, and who would hurt you just to hurt me if they knew how much you meant to me. My hands were trembling as I read, because this David, this man who worked for dangerous people, was a complete stranger to me. But even as I read his confession about a life I never knew he had lived, part of me was still questioning whether this was real, or if I was having some kind of psychological break from grief. The David I knew sold insurance, worried about his credit score, and got nervous when we went 5 miles over the speed limit. He wasn't someone who lived in the shadows, or had enemies who would stage his death. Could 3 months of loneliness and sorrow have damaged my mind so badly that I was creating elaborate fantasies just to bring him back to life, even if the version I was bringing back was someone I had never met? The letter continued with details about offshore accounts, fake identities, and a life he had been living parallel to our relationship for reasons he said he couldn't explain until we met face to face. I know this doesn't make sense, and I know you have every right to hate me for lying to you about who I really am, but everything I felt for you was real, Emma. You were the one pure and honest thing in a life filled with deception, and losing you will be the price I pay for the choices I made before I found you. Reading those words felt like falling through the floor of everything I had believed about our life together. As I sat there holding that letter, I realized I was faced with an impossible choice. Either David was alive, and everything about our relationship had been built on lies, or I was losing my grip on reality so completely that I was fabricating evidence of miracles that couldn't exist. Both options terrified me in different ways, because I wasn't sure which would be worse, discovering that the love of my life was a stranger, or accepting that grief had broken my mind beyond repair. But the phone buzzing with another message would force me to make a decision that would change the course of my life forever. The third message arrived while I was still holding David's letter, and this time it contained specific instructions that would either prove his existence or expose my complete break from reality. Have you ever been so desperate for something to be true that you were willing to risk everything, even your sanity, just for the possibility of a miracle? The message was simple, but clear. Meet me tonight at Riverside Park, by the old oak tree where we had our first picnic, at exactly midnight. Come alone, tell no one, and bring the letter so you know this is real. Riverside Park was 30 minutes outside the city, a place David and I had discovered by accident during one of our weekend drives when we got lost trying to find a farmer's market. We had ended up having an impromptu picnic under this massive oak tree, sharing gas station sandwiches and warm soda, while talking about our dreams and fears, until the sun started to set. It was one of those perfect moments that you can't plan or recreate, and the fact that this mysterious person knew about it made my heart race with possibilities I was afraid to believe. Nobody else knew about that day. Not our friends, not our families, because it had been ours alone. But as the hours ticked by toward midnight, doubt started creeping in like poison, whispering that I was about to do something incredibly dangerous based on what might be an elaborate hoax. What if someone had been watching us during our relationship, learning our private moments, our secret places, our intimate details, just so they could torture me with false hope when I was at my most vulnerable? What if this was some sick person who got pleasure from manipulating grieving women, who had studied David and me so carefully that they could imitate his voice, his handwriting, his memories? The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to call the police, to stay home, to protect myself from whatever cruel game this might be. Yet despite all my logical fears, I found myself getting dressed and driving toward Riverside Park as midnight approached, because the possibility that David was really alive was stronger than my fear of being hurt or deceived. The drive felt like it took forever, and no time at all, my mind racing between hope and terror, between prayers that this was real, and preparations for the disappointment that would probably kill what was left of my heart. I kept the letter clutched in my hand like a talisman, reading and rereading his words, searching for some sign that would tell me definitively whether I was about to be reunited with my soulmate or walking into a trap. As I pulled into the empty parking lot at Riverside Park, I realized that nothing would ever be the same after tonight, regardless of what I found under that oak tree. Either I was about to discover that David had been living a double life that made our entire relationship a lie, or I was about to prove to myself that grief had broken my mind so completely that I was chasing fantasies in the middle of the night. Both possibilities were terrifying, but the hope that maybe, just maybe, I was about to hold him again was stronger than any fear I had ever felt. What I found waiting for me in the darkness would answer some questions, but create mysteries I never could have imagined. The walk from my car to the old oak tree felt like the longest journey of my life, every step echoing in the silence of the empty park like a countdown to either my salvation or my complete destruction. Have you ever walked toward something that could change your entire existence, knowing that there was no turning back once you took that final step? The moonlight cast strange shadows through the branches, making familiar shapes look foreign and threatening, and I found myself wondering if I was walking toward the love of my life, or into the most dangerous moment I had ever experienced. As I approached our special tree, I could see a figure sitting on the ground with his back against the massive trunk, and even in the dim light, I recognized the silhouette that had been burned into my memory through 5 years of love and 3 months of grief. My heart started beating so fast I thought it might explode, because it was him. It was really David, sitting in the exact spot where we had shared our first picnic and talked about spending forever together. He looked thinner than I remembered, older somehow, with longer hair and the shadow of a beard that changed his face in ways that made him seem like a stranger and familiar all at once. "Emma," he said softly as I approached, and the sound of his voice saying my name nearly brought me to my knees with relief and confusion and a dozen other emotions I couldn't identify. But when he stood up and I could see his face clearly in the moonlight, something was wrong with his eyes. They held a sadness and a fear that I had never seen before, like he was carrying secrets so heavy they were crushing him from the inside. He reached toward me but stopped himself, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to touch me anymore, and that hesitation broke my heart in ways that were different, but just as painful as losing him the first time. "I know you have questions," he said, his voice rough and tired in a way that made him sound like a different person entirely. "I know this is impossible to understand, And I know you probably hate me for what I've put you through, but everything I'm about to tell you is going to sound crazy." He pulled out a thick envelope from his jacket pocket, and I could see his hands shaking just as much as mine were, which somehow made this whole surreal situation feel more real. "The people I worked for before I met you, they found me, Emma. They were going to kill both of us, so I had to make them think I was already dead. But even as I stood there looking at the man I had loved and mourned and dreamed about for months, something felt wrong in a way I couldn't put my finger on, like puzzle pieces that looked right, but didn't quite fit together perfectly. His mannerisms were slightly different. His voice had an edge I didn't remember, and when he looked at me, it felt like he was studying my reactions rather than just being happy to see me alive. The David I knew would have held me by now, would have kissed me, would have cried with relief at being reunited. But this man was keeping his distance like he was afraid of something I couldn't understand. What I was about to discover would make me realize that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in the package of answered prayers. Standing there in the moonlight, looking at David's face for the first time in 3 months, I realized that getting what you've prayed for every single day can sometimes be more devastating than losing it in the first place. Have you ever had a moment when you realized that the person you thought you knew better than yourself was actually a complete stranger? If you've ever felt the ground disappear beneath your feet while you were standing perfectly still, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what I learned that night about betrayal and deception will show you that sometimes the deepest cuts come from the people who claim to love you most. The insurance company, the normal job, the quiet life we built together. None of it was real, Emma, David said, his words hitting me like physical blows that made my chest feel like it was caving in. I was working for people who launder money through legitimate businesses, and when they suspected I was skimming from their operations, they decided to make an example of me. He showed me documents, photographs, bank statements that painted a picture of a man I had never met, someone who lived in shadows and dealt with criminals while coming home to me every night, and pretending to be concerned about our credit score and what to plant in our little garden. But the worst revelation was still coming, and when he finally told me the truth about why he had really faked his death, I felt something break inside me that I knew would never heal completely. They weren't just coming for me, Emma. They had pictures of you. They knew your schedule. They knew where you worked and where you shopped and what coffee shop you went to every Tuesday morning. His voice cracked as he continued. I realized that loving you had put you in danger, and the only way to save your life was to disappear from it forever. The accident, the death certificate, the funeral. I arranged all of it to make them believe I was gone so they would leave you alone. What made this betrayal so devastating wasn't just that he had lied about who he was, but that he had made the decision to fake his death without giving me a choice in my own fate. He had watched me plan his funeral, had let me grieve and fall apart, and question whether I wanted to keep living, all while he was alive and safe somewhere, thinking he was protecting me. "You let me bury an empty coffin," I whispered, the words barely audible because my throat felt like it was closing up. "You let me cry over a grave that meant nothing while you were out there breathing and thinking this was somehow an act of love." The man standing in front of me looked like David, sounded like David, had all of David's memories and mannerisms, but he was someone I had never really known at all. 5 years of my life had been built on lies so elaborate that they had their own documentation, their own history, their own carefully constructed reality that was designed to keep me from ever discovering the truth about who I had fallen in love with. As I stood there processing the magnitude of his deception, I realized that the David I had been mourning for 3 months had never actually existed. He had been a character in a play that was performed just for me, and the real David was a stranger who had just destroyed my ability to trust my own judgment about anything ever again. But what he told me next would prove that this nightmare was far from over. As I stood there in the darkness trying to process everything David had told me, a new and terrifying thought began to creep into my mind like poison spreading through my veins. Have you ever realized that the person you trusted most in the world might be lying to you, even as they claim to be telling you the truth? Something about his story didn't add up. Something about the way he kept looking over his shoulder and checking his phone. Something about how he seemed more concerned with convincing me than with actually being reunited after months of separation. If you've ever felt that sickening moment when you realize you're being manipulated by someone you love, hit that subscribe button and like this video, because what I discovered next would teach me that betrayal has layers, and sometimes the deepest cuts are still coming. "Why now, David?" I asked, my voice stronger than I felt inside. because 3 months of grief had taught me to question everything, even miracles. Why risk contacting me now if staying dead was the only way to keep me safe? His answer came too quickly, too rehearsed, like he had been practicing it. Because the danger has passed. Because the people who wanted to hurt us are gone now. Because I couldn't stay away from you anymore. But something in his eyes when he said those words made my stomach turn. Because I had learned to read David's tells during our 5 years together, and he was lying to me even now. The more I listened to his explanations, the more holes I started to find in his story. Details that didn't quite make sense when you put them all together. He claimed he had been hiding for months, but his skin had a tan like he'd been somewhere sunny, and his clothes were expensive in a way that didn't match someone who had been living underground. When I asked him specific questions about the people who had supposedly threatened us, his answers were vague and generic, like someone who had watched too many crime movies but had never actually lived that reality. But the moment that shattered my last hope that this reunion could somehow lead to healing came when I asked him about the funeral, about what it had felt like to watch me fall apart while he was alive and safe somewhere else. "I wasn't there, Emma," he said, looking away from me. I couldn't risk being seen, even from a distance. That's when I knew for certain that he was lying, because I had felt someone watching me during the service, had turned around several times with the strange sensation that familiar eyes were on me, and now I realized that my instincts had been right. Standing there in the park where we had once been so happy, I finally understood that David hadn't contacted me because he loved me or missed me or couldn't stay away. He had contacted me because he needed something from me, something that required him to manipulate my grief and love and desperate hope for his return. The David I had mourned was gone forever, not because he was dead, but because he had never existed in the first place. And the man standing in front of me was someone who was willing to torture me with false hope to get whatever it was he really wanted. But I was about to learn that this whole elaborate charade was just the beginning of a deception so twisted that it would make me question everything I thought I knew about love, truth, and my own sanity. The moment I stopped believing David's story completely was when he pulled out a second phone and started typing a message to someone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen like he was reporting into someone else about how our conversation was going. Have you ever watched someone you love transform before your eyes into a stranger? Like their real face was finally showing through a mask they had been wearing for years? That's when I realized that this whole reunion, this elaborate staging of messages and secret meetings, wasn't about love or protection or keeping me safe. It was about something much more sinister that would make me understand that sometimes the person who destroys you is the same person who once made you believe in fairy tales. "Who are you texting, David?" I asked, my voice now steady with a coldness I didn't recognize in myself, because grief and betrayal had been teaching me to trust my instincts even when they pointed toward painful truths. He looked up from his phone with surprise, like he had forgotten I was standing there, and for just a split second, I saw something in his expression that chilled me to the bone. Calculation, assessment, like he was deciding how much truth he could afford to give me without ruining whatever plan he was really executing. "I need to ask you something, Emma, and I need you to be completely honest with me," he said, putting his phone away, but not before I saw him finish sending that mysterious message. "Before the accident, did I ever mention anything to you about life insurance policies? About investments? About money I might have set aside for emergencies?" That's when the final piece of this sick puzzle clicked into place. Because David hadn't faked his death to protect me from dangerous criminals. He had faked his death to collect on insurance policies that required him to be declared legally dead first. The man I had loved, the man I had mourned, the man I had nearly destroyed myself grieving for, had used our entire relationship as a cover story for an elaborate insurance fraud scheme that required a grieving fiancé to make his death seem believable and tragic. All those times he had talked about taking care of me if anything ever happened to him, all those discussions about life insurance and financial planning that I thought showed how much he loved me, had actually been him setting up the paperwork for his own fake death. He needed me to be the perfect grieving widow who would never question the official story, who would cry at his funeral and miss him publicly, and make everyone believe that his death was a genuine tragedy. But now he was back because something had gone wrong with his plan, because the insurance company or the authorities or someone else was asking questions that required the grieving fiancé to provide answers or access or information that only I could give him. Standing there in the moonlight, looking at this man who had shaped 5 years of my life around an elaborate lie, I realized that I hadn't lost the love of my life in a tragic accident. I had been systematically destroyed by someone who had never loved me at all, Someone who had seen my devotion and trust as tools to be used in a criminal enterprise that treated my heart like a prop in his performance. The David I thought I knew had been murdered by the David who was standing in front of me, and I was just now meeting his killer for the first time. Standing there in that park, staring at the man who had used my love as a weapon against my own heart, I felt something shift inside me that would change everything about how I saw myself and my future. Have you ever reached a point where the pain was so complete that it somehow became a source of power, where hitting rock bottom gave you something solid to push against? If you've ever had to rebuild yourself from nothing after someone destroyed everything you thought was real, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what I learned about healing and strength in the aftermath of ultimate betrayal might help you find your own way back to wholeness when everything seems lost. The drive home from Riverside Park was the loneliest and most liberating journey of my life, because for the first time in months, I wasn't mourning David anymore. I was mourning the version of myself that had been naive enough to believe that love was always honest and that trust was always deserved. I called the police from my car and told them everything, gave them the letter, the text messages, the details about where they could find David and his elaborate fraud scheme, because the woman who would have protected him out of misplaced loyalty had died in that park along with my last illusions about who he really was. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of police interviews, insurance investigations, and legal proceedings that forced me to relive every detail of our relationship through the lens of criminal deception rather than romantic love. But instead of feeling more broken by each new revelation about David's lies, I started feeling stronger, because each piece of evidence proved that my instincts had been right all along. There had been something wrong, something missing, something that didn't quite add up about the man I thought I was going to marry. My subconscious had been trying to warn me for years, and finally learning to trust those instincts felt like coming home to myself. The hardest part wasn't accepting that David had never loved me, but forgiving myself for being willing to sacrifice my own judgment and intuition on the altar of what I thought was love. I had ignored red flags, explained away inconsistencies, and made excuses for behaviors that should have made me ask harder questions, all because I wanted so desperately to believe in the fairy tale he was selling me. But recognizing those patterns wasn't a reason for shame. It was information I could use to build a better relationship with myself, one based on self-respect, rather than the desperate need to be chosen by someone else. As the legal case against David moved forward, and the insurance fraud investigation revealed the full scope of his deception, I started to understand that healing wasn't about getting over what happened to me. It was about getting stronger because of what happened to me. Every day that I chose to trust my own perceptions over someone else's manipulation, every day that I prioritized my own well-being over someone else's approval, every day that I refused to let his betrayal make me bitter or closed off to future love, was a day that I was taking my power back from someone who had stolen it through lies and false promises. But the most important lesson was still waiting for me. 6 months after that night in Riverside Park, I was sitting in the same coffee shop where David and I used to meet for weekend breakfast dates, but this time I wasn't there drowning in memories. I was there celebrating the completion of my master's degree, something I had put on hold during our relationship, because he had convinced me that his dreams were more important than mine. Have you ever realized that losing someone who was wrong for you actually created space for you to become who you were always meant to be? The woman sitting in that coffee shop was someone I had never been allowed to become while I was trying to be what David needed me to be, and she was stronger, wiser, and more authentic than I had ever imagined possible. The legal proceedings had concluded with David being sentenced to 5 years for insurance fraud, identity theft, and a dozen other charges that painted a picture of someone who had been running elaborate cons long before he met me. During the trial, I learned that I hadn't been his first victim. There had been other women, other fake identities, other carefully constructed lives built on lies and manipulation that he had used to fund his real lifestyle. But instead of making me feel worse, knowing that his betrayal hadn't been personal somehow made it easier to heal, because it proved that his inability to love authentically was about his character defects, not about my worth as a person. The most surprising part of recovery was discovering who I was when I wasn't trying to be half of someone else's whole, when I wasn't editing myself to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. I started taking art classes, something David had always dismissed as impractical, and discovered that I had a talent for painting that brought me more joy than any romantic relationship ever had. I traveled to places he had never wanted to go, read books he had found boring, listened to music he had called noise, and with each new experience, I fell a little more in love with the person I was becoming. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that David's betrayal had actually been a gift, because it had forced me to develop the most important relationship of my life, the one with myself. Learning to trust my own instincts, to validate my own feelings, to prioritize my own needs, and to love myself with the same devotion I had once wasted on someone who didn't deserve it, had transformed me into someone who would never again settle for crumbs when I deserved the whole feast. I started to understand that being alone wasn't something to fear, it was something to celebrate, because it meant I was free to become whoever I wanted to be, without having to ask permission or compromise my dreams. The woman who had once been willing to pack away her own identity to make room for David's lies was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't accept anything less than authentic love, honest communication, and mutual respect. I learned that healing isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about using the pain as fertilizer for growth, about letting the betrayal teach you to recognize red flags, and about refusing to let someone else's inability to love genuinely make you close your heart to the possibility of real love in the future. What I discovered about the difference between surviving and thriving would change everything about how I approached relationships, goals, and life itself. 2 years later, I received another unexpected message, but this time it was from someone I had met in my art class, a man named James, who asked if I wanted to get coffee and talk about the painting I had been working on that week. Have you ever noticed how life has a way of bringing you exactly what you need when you're finally ready to receive it? When you've done the work to become someone who can recognize genuine love when it shows up? If this story has touched your heart, or reminded you of your own journey through betrayal and healing, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because sharing our stories of survival and transformation is how we help others find their way back to themselves when everything feels broken. The difference between David's manipulative messages and James's honest invitation was like the difference between a house built on sand and one built on solid rock. You could feel the authenticity in every word, the genuine interest in getting to know me rather than using me for some hidden agenda. When James texted me, he wasn't trying to convince me of anything or sell me a story about who he was. He was simply being himself and inviting me to do the same. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours, and not once did I feel like I needed to be anyone other than exactly who I was, scars and strength and all. What I learned about love during those 2 years of healing was that real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself to make someone else feel bigger, doesn't ask you to ignore your instincts to preserve someone else's comfort, and doesn't make you question your own sanity to maintain someone else's version of reality. Real love celebrates your growth, encourages your dreams, and makes you feel more like yourself rather than less. James saw my paintings and wanted to hear the stories behind them. He learned about my past with David and admired my strength in surviving it rather than seeing me as damaged goods. The message that really changed everything wasn't David's manipulation disguised as love. It was my own inner voice finally becoming loud enough to drown out anyone who tried to convince me I was worth less than I knew I was. Learning to listen to that voice, to trust it, to follow it even when it led me away from what looked like love but felt like diminishment, was the skill that transformed my life. Every red flag I had ignored with David became a green flag I could recognize with James. Every boundary I had abandoned in my old relationship became a foundation stone in my new one. Today, as I write this story, I'm sitting in the home James and I bought together, surrounded by my paintings and his books, planning a wedding that will be based on truth rather than lies, commitment rather than convenience, and mutual growth rather than one person's need to control another. The real message that changed everything wasn't sent through a phone. It was written in the courage I found to love myself enough to demand authenticity from everyone who wanted a place in my life. If you're going through your own journey of betrayal, heartbreak, or healing, remember that sometimes losing the wrong person is the first step toward finding the right life. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after someone you trusted destroyed everything you thought was real? Share your story in the comments below. Subscribe for more real stories of survival and transformation. And remember that your greatest comeback is always still ahead of you.